The books from Joshua to 2 Kings, apart from Ruth, are a 6-volume work of history come prophecy, declaring God's point of view on the various events in their background. You might possibly have come across some Bibles which label the books of Samuel and Kings as 1, 2, 3 and 4 Kings, although I haven't seen that recently. The 3 samples we'll take, the first will be concerning the call of Samuel, the second announcing that David is to be king, and the third the contest on Mount Carmel. For the first then, if you'd like to turn to the very beginning of the first book of Samuel, now I think the best thing for you to do here is that you should read the whole of chapter 1 and then come back to me. The story starts with Elkanah having 2 wives and his favourite Hannah having no children. The other wife, Peninnah, was, to put it mildly, a bit of a cow. She'd produced several children for Elkanah and was constantly taunting Hannah that she was still childless. Hannah, for her part, regularly pleaded with the Lord to give her a son. At one time, she was in the shrine at Shiloh, where the Ark of the Covenant was kept, and she prayed for a son. If you look at verse 11 in 1 Samuel 1. When I was about 7, I was severely ill with pneumonia. The doctor thought I was within a day or 2 of dying of it. My dad knelt by my bed and pleaded with the Lord to give me back my life. He even echoed Hannah's vow and said that if the Lord gave me back to him, he would give me back to the Lord. He wasn't quite sure what he meant by that, but he did know he meant it. That evening, the doctor, who belongs to the Plymouth Brethren, also set about his prayers, laying his day's work before the Lord, and when he came to praying about me, the Lord told him to return to me at once and inject me with the still rather new drug penicillin. He even told the doctor what dose to use, and it was more than the doctor had ever given to an adult. About 9:30 that evening, the doctor appeared at our house, told Dad what had happened. Dad obviously said, well, if the Lord told you to do it, you better come in and do it. I don't remember that evening. I'd been delirious for several days, but I do remember the indignity of some of the follow-up injections in my backside, because my temperature went down during that night and I was well on the way out of the pneumonia. I thought I'd tell you that story as a parallel to Hannah's story, so that her story doesn't just seem totally locked in the distant past, because it has some points of contact with that story from my childhood. If you look at verses 12 to 14 in this first chapter, just like reading without saying words out loud is a fairly recent invention, so praying silently or under your breath wasn't something that Eli had come across, and he mistook it for the mumblings of a drunken woman, and he told her off accordingly. Happily, he believed the account she then gave of herself, and prayed that the Lord would answer her prayer. Verse 9 is interesting because it mentions the temple, the Lord's house. NIV footnote tells us that this has to mean tabernacle, but it's more complicated than that. It might have struck you as rather strange that after the amount of space taken up by the tabernacle in Exodus and Numbers, we scarcely hear anything of it later. There are 2 uses of the word tabernacle in Joshua 22, nothing else in the other Deuteronomic history books, and just a few mentions in Chronicles and Psalms. Also the term tent of meeting, probably meaning the tabernacle. It sometimes meant a different place, but sometimes it clearly means the tabernacle. That occurs twice in Joshua and once each in the books of Samuel and Kings. There are also plenty of mentions of the Ark of the Covenant. So what did happen to the tabernacle itself once they'd arrived in the Promised Land? We know there were shrines at different places in the land, Shiloh being the most important, and we hear occasional mentions of the Ark, but no description of the places where the Ark was housed. In fact, if the shrine in Shiloh was the tabernacle, then what was it doing with the doorpost and doors which Samuel opened in 3 verse 15? That doesn't sound like a tented arrangement at all. So perhaps NIV is being a bit hasty in saying that the reference here of the Lord's house or the temple, whichever version of NIV you've got, means tabernacle. We don't actually know what it means. Verse 20, the Lord answered Hannah's prayer and gave her a baby boy whom she called Samuel. She remembered the promise she'd made to the Lord, so when the boy had been weaned, which takes us to verse 24, she took him to Shiloh to leave him there to serve the priest Eli. The dedication prayer there is well worth a read, the beginning of chapter 2. You might like to read it and compare it with Mary's prayer in the first chapter of Luke, the Magnificat. I can't escape the conclusion that Mary knew Hannah's prayer and knew it well, and built her own prayer around bits of that. Anyway, there was a problem in leaving the boy to serve Eli as his assistant, namely that Eli wasn't a very good priest. Although he went through the motions of being a priest, he wasn't that close to the Lord. And he had 2 sons who were seriously abusing their position. There was a constant stream of women coming to worship at the sanctuary and, well, you can guess the rest of the story. And Eli didn't do enough to try to stop them. In fact, Eli had been given a promise that his sons would not succeed him as priest when he died, but that his successor would be a proper man of God. Ouch. Now if you'd like to read, please, chapter 3, the first 10 verses. Verse 1. Samuel carried out priestly duties. Well, he was of the tribe of Levi, so he was of the right lineage to do things like that. He was allowed to do that sort of thing. It was at a time, though, when genuine prophecy was very rare. Spiritually, the nation was at a low ebb. Verse 3. This was where Samuel lived, in the sanctuary itself, not in a nearby house, but actually in the shrine. The ark had been made during the Exodus and was the visible symbol of the presence of God. But any other sign of God's presence would have taken them very much by surprise. Religion was being done, but you could doubt whether the Lord was actually turning up to take part in it. Verse 4, but on this occasion he did turn up to speak to Samuel. Samuel heard the Lord calling and thought it was Eli calling. Verse 5, presumably he woke Eli up by going to him, and Eli said, no, I didn't call. Verse 6, it happened all over again. Verse 7, you need to understand that Samuel at this point had no personal relationship with the Lord. He knew religion, but he didn't know God. You should also understand that much the same could be said of Eli. Verse 8, when the whole routine happened a third time, the penny dropped for Eli. He realized it must have been the Lord calling the boy, so in verse 9 he counselled Samuel as to how to respond if the Lord called again. Verse 10, he did, and this time Samuel did as Eli had advised and spoke to the Lord rather than to the priest. Although Samuel was only a lad, the Lord gives him here a substantial prophecy of what will become of Eli and his sons, if you read from verse 11 to 21. Verse 15. I suspect Samuel didn't get any more sleep that night as he lay there. In the morning he returned to his duty and opened the doors of the sanctuary to show they were open for business. But he had a problem. I reckon he'd been mulling over all night what was going to happen when he and Eli met. Eli was bound to ask whether the Lord had called him again, so what should Samuel say? He obviously didn't want to begin his prophetic career by announcing to the very man who was acting his guardian that the Lord was rejecting him. Not a good start. Verses 16 to 18, Eli did ask the relevant questions and pressed the boy to tell him everything. Perhaps Eli suspected that a word from the Lord coming into that sanctuary would be much the same as the judgmental word he'd already been given by another prophet, so he was ready for it. And he submitted to the word, no huffing and puffing. The Lord was obviously right, even though it must have been quite awkward for Eli that young Samuel was now aware of just how things were. Verse 19. The Lord then watched over Samuel's growth, not least the growth of his prophetic gifting. Verse 20, and his gifting was recognized throughout the land. When we think of Old Testament prophets, we're most likely to think of the likes of Isaiah and Ezekiel, people who were used to bringing major words of prophecy and whose words are recorded at length in the Bible. Samuel wasn't quite in that mould. He did have words to bring to particular people, like he'd been given this word about Eli and his family. But his contribution to the life of the nation was much more as a man of God than as a bringer of messages from the Lord. And in his generation, he was about the only person to be used in that way, and national recognition had put him into the position of being a sort of national leader, at least until kings were appointed. Well, that's our first sample from these books. Our second sample has Samuel not as a child, but at the height of his powers, when the Lord uses him to anoint David to be the next king of Israel. If you'd like to find your way to 1 Samuel 16, but we'll have a look at something else first before we get there. 1 and 2 Samuel are full of the most delightful stories. I mean, if you were brought up as a Christian, then you'll certainly recall several of them. And one of the most celebrated of them is this account of how Samuel anointed David to be king. Let's go back to the point where people asked Samuel to appoint someone to reign over them. They lived as a loose confederation of tribes with no office of national leader, and other nations around had their kings, so it seemed to the Israelites thought it would be better off if they had one too. Probably best, actually, if you read chapter 8, verses 1 to 22 here, and then come back to me, so you'll have the full picture then. The Bible is ambivalent as to whether the Lord thought that having a king was a good idea, so it was with some reluctance that Samuel complied. And in anointing Saul to be king, he was taking someone who was head and shoulders taller than the rest of the population, every inch a leader of men, by the look of him every inch a general in war. But Saul's reign went badly. He was given to bouts of severe depression, bordering on madness, which if anything got worse as the years passed. And when Samuel died, and Saul felt pretty much alone, he sealed his fate by disobeying the Lord in trying to consult the spirit of dead Samuel through the witch at Endor. That's 1 Samuel 28. But before that, while Samuel was still alive, the Lord let him know that a new king should be set up, and not Saul's son Jonathan. Jonathan was a fine young man. He and David were very close friends, Jonathan having to hide his friendship with David because of Saul's likely anger. But the Lord knew that Jonathan wouldn't survive to succeed his father. Samuel had been reluctant to anoint Saul in the first place, and seeing how his reign had turned out, Samuel was pretty low in spirits. In fact, he was already in mourning for Saul, even though Saul was still alive. Well, this is where we turn to chapter 16 of 1 Samuel, if you'd like to read the first verse. The Lord gave Samuel a clear instruction. Stop brooding on what's gone wrong. I've got a plan, and I need you to get it going. You're to go to Bethlehem. I've chosen one of Jesse's sons to be king. Read, please, verses 2 and 3. Verse 2. This gave Samuel a problem. He was such a high-profile character that he wouldn't do anything without Saul noticing. If he went to Bethlehem, Saul would be suspicious, especially if he was in one of his less rational moods. He could easily fly into a rage and even possibly kill Samuel. So the Lord suggests using religion as a cover. Samuel was to go to Bethlehem to sacrifice a heifer, but he was to make sure that Jesse and his sons were invited to the sacrifice. We often call on the Lord for protection, and usually we expect the answer to be that the Lord will work behind the scenes on our behalf. But here he schools Samuel in how to be a bit crafty and reduce the likelihood that Saul will smell a rat. Another form of protection. If you'd like to read, please, verses 4 and 5. Samuel did as instructed, but although the religious ploy had fooled Saul, it put the wind up the town elders in Bethlehem. What does Samuel want? Why's he come here to sacrifice? What have we done wrong? So they did a shalom, but pretty much as a question. And Samuel responded with a clear shalom. There were ways in which people usually prepared for a ceremony such as he was proposing, consecrating themselves, they called it. So he told everyone to do that, although he personally supervised the preparation of Jesse and his sons. We're not actually told whether Samuel got as far as conducting the sacrifice, because the real interest lies in how he looked over Jesse's sons to see which one he thought the Lord was choosing to be king. If you read, please, verses 6 and 7. Eliab was obviously a fine young man, and Samuel presumably thought that with Eliab's physical appearance plus the Lord's anointing, he could be the king that Saul had never quite been. But the Lord rebuked Samuel and told him that physical appearance shouldn't come into it. When the Lord looks at someone, he sees what's going on inside that person, and it's on that basis that he will choose the next king. Well, this put Samuel in an awkward position. At the start of this process, he thought he knew what he was doing. But now he had to be more tentative. So he looked over all the other sons by turns, and each time knew that the Lord was saying no. If you read verses 8 to 10, please. Jesse was acting as a sort of stage manager in bringing his sons to Samuel by turns. But then Samuel had a problem. He'd seen all of Jesse's sons, it seems, and was convinced that the Lord had said no to each of them. Had he misread the Lord's promptings? He didn't think so. There was, of course, one other logical possibility. If you'll read 11 to 13, please. Verse 11. David, the youngest in the family, was clearly in his element out in the fields tending the sheep. But quite apart from that, he was the youngest, therefore the one they could most obviously do without at the sacrifice. So Samuel holds up the entire procedure until David arrives. Verse 12. He was a good-looking young man, well sun-tanned because of his many hours in the fields. And as soon as Samuel set eyes on him, he got a mighty prod from the Lord. This is the one. The Lord had told Samuel that he judges people by looking at their hearts. Earlier, when Samuel was telling Saul a few home truths, he'd said that the Lord was seeking to replace Saul with a man after his own heart. That's 1 Samuel 13, verse 14. Clearly, by looking at these young men's hearts, that's what the Lord had found in David. Verse 13. So the anointing took place. Olive oil as a symbol of the Lord anointing David with his spirit. The symbol was used, and the reality followed. David's heart had been very much in the right place as far as the Lord was concerned, and now he matured as someone living day by day in the presence of the Lord, with the Lord his constant companion. You can tell from the Psalms which David wrote, he had a directness and an ease of conversation with the Lord. As for Saul, his days were numbered. David didn't take over as king until Saul and Jonathan were both killed in a battle. But Saul was doomed. Whatever blessing the Lord had once given him was withdrawn, and he was left in his moodiness to drift into worse madness. As things turned out over the centuries, Saul may have been their first king, but David was always taken to be their archetypal king. All their ideas about what being a king was really about were built around David. Even when they began to look forward for Messiah, He really had to be a king of the royal house of David. Nothing else would do. That's our second sample. Our third sample takes us to 1 Kings 18. Elijah was the first big prophet after Samuel. Samuel had functioned for much of his life as the national leader. Well, Elijah had no such role as that. He was simply a prophet, and he was looked back to by the Jews in later years as, in many ways, the archetypal prophet. By Elijah's time, Israel had divided in two. Most of the tribes had rebelled against the Jerusalem leadership, and they'd set themselves up in the north of the country, hijacking the name Israel for their rebel kingdom. Elijah lived in the northern kingdom, and he was prominent enough that on suitable occasions he had dealings even with the king of Israel, who reigned in the capital city of Samaria. That king was Ahab, a fairly nasty piece of work, but he was a saint compared to his wife, Queen Jezebel. To this day, her name is used as a byword for a treacherous woman. She was an out-and-out worshipper of Baal, and she directly funded hundreds of low-grade prophets of Baal and of the goddess Asherah. You can imagine that such behaviour made Elijah see red. Elijah even prophesied that the prolonged drought in Israel was God's judgment on the people for allowing these pagan gods and forgetting their covenant with him. 1 Kings 18, if you read please the first 6 verses. Verse 1. The famine caused by the drought had been going on for over 2 years. The Lord decided that the punishment had been enough, so he told Elijah to go to King Ahab and announce the coming of rain. But Elijah going to Ahab was rather like sticking your head in a lion's mouth, just not wise. Verse 3, so Elijah approached the matter cautiously. Instead of just marching into the palace, he sought out the palace manager, a man called Obadiah, who had remained loyal to the Lord throughout the reign of Ahab and Jezebel. Verse 4, you can tell how faithful he'd been by this story, that Jezebel was openly seeking out the Lord's prophets and killing them. Here prophets should be taken to refer to the bands of charismatics, not to major figures like Elijah. Elijah was the only figure like himself at the time. Obadiah had then hidden 100 prophets of the Lord, hidden them in 2 caves, and supplied them with food while they were there. It must have involved substantial risk for the palace manager to do that. Well, verse 5, just before Elijah decided to find Obadiah, the king had ordered a search for grass to feed their horses. Ahab and Obadiah were to do the searching, each covering different territories. If you read, please, verse 7 to verse 15. Verse 7. Elijah then succeeded in finding Obadiah out in open country away from the palace. Obadiah was delighted to see him. He'd been an ardent supporter of Elijah as long as he could remember. Verse 8, his mood, however, changed dramatically as soon as Elijah told him to go and tell Ahab that Elijah wanted to see him. The worst-case scenario was that Obadiah would tell Ahab where Elijah was, Ahab would rush to find Elijah there, but Elijah would have moved on somewhere else, and in that case Obadiah would be in for the chop. Don't do this to me, he says. At 15, Elijah reassured him that he genuinely wanted to meet Ahab, and he wanted to do so that very day. He was not going to do a runner. Read please 16 to 18. Obadiah went and told Ahab where Elijah was. Ahab went to the spot, met Elijah with the greeting, "Is that you, you troubler of Israel?" It was difficult for a meeting between these two men not to turn into a slanging match, so it's probably a compliment to Elijah that he remained cool and got himself in charge of the way that the conversation went. Obviously he had to respond to Ahab's greeting that the real troubler of Israel was Ahab himself, more than ably assisted by his wife. Ahab had avidly carried on his family tradition of wandering well away from the Lord and into the hands of the Baals. Well, having seized the moral high ground in that way in the conversation, Elijah then proposes a power contest to see who is the real God. Is it Baal or is it Yahweh? Read please 19 to 24. Verse 19, Mount Carmel was a suitably dramatic spot between the big coastal plain of Israel and the coast itself. And Jezebel had funded about 450 prophets of Baal, so Elijah proposed two teams, those 450 to be one team, himself on his own in the other, apart from the fact that the Lord would be with him. 21. Elijah then did a public speech to the assembled company, led by a variety of kings. They were used to meandering between the worship of Yahweh and the worship of Baal. Okay, he says, let's settle it. Who really is God? Verse 23, he proposes sacrificing two bulls, one to Baal and one to Yahweh. But the catch is this: they must each leave it to their own God to light the fire under the bull. If you read now, please, 25 to 29. Elijah told the Baalists to go first, so they set the bull on an altar and spent all morning calling on Baal to set it alight. But no fire came. They even did some impressive ritual dances. Still no fire. So Elijah teased them. Perhaps they needed to shout louder to attract the god's attention. Verse 28, they took the bait. They turned up the volume. They even started slashing themselves with knives in an attempt to add power to their worship, but to no avail. And they did this all through the afternoon, and still no fire. Then it was Elijah's turn. If you read, please, 30 to 35. On the top of Mount Carmel there had been an altar to the Lord. But under the leadership of Ahab and his like, it had not been used, it had fallen into disrepair. So Elijah first repaired it. Verse 32, then he dug a trench around the altar, before putting on the altar the wood for the fire, and then the bull. In an act of supreme confidence in the Lord, he then had a very large quantity of water brought to the spot and poured over the altar, such that it even filled the trench around the altar. If you read, please, 36 to 39. So Elijah prayed to the Lord. No shouting, no dancing, no slashing his arms, just a clear, confident prayer. Verse 38, bang! The fire fell, consumed the wood, consumed the bull, even evaporated all the water in the trench. Quite spectacular. And verse 39, the general public watching the contest clearly regarded this as proof that Baal was rubbish and that Yahweh was the real God. Verse 40, if you read that, please. Elijah then did the only possible thing in their culture. He had the prophets of Baal slaughtered. They had tied their lives to a God who was no God. They had sealed their own fate. And there's a footnote, if you read it, please, 41 to 46. You remember that there'd been a drought for over 2 years. Elijah shut himself off, presumably in prayer, and repeatedly sent his servant to see if there was any sign of a rain cloud. 7 times he did this. 6 times the servant came back and reported no clouds. And the 7th time he said there was just the tiniest cloud coming in from the sea. And Elijah then sent the message to Ahab that he'd better ride his chariot to Jezreel. I think he had a base there. And he'd better do it quickly, before so much rain came that his chariot would get bogged down. Perhaps because of the phenomenally heavy rain that did soon start, Elijah himself found it possible to run and keep ahead of Ahab's chariot as it was getting bogged down, and Elijah got to Jezreel before the king did. Now, I don't think that Ahab became much more fond of the Lord after this, but it must have made a big impression on the general public who'd witnessed the contest. And certainly Jezebel was furious, and Elijah had to run for his life. The point remains, though, that the contest between two religions isn't just a matter of who puts on the best show, or who has the finest sounding words. It's not even a matter of how popular each religion is. There is genuinely an issue of who is the real God. And this context provided evidence that the real God was Yahweh. What we've seen in the New Testament clearly associates this God with Jesus, and the real God power is seen in the miracles of Jesus, and most especially in his cross and resurrection. As Paul said at the beginning of Romans, Jesus was declared with power to be the Son of God by his resurrection from the dead. So Mount Carmel is a power contest or a power exhibition, and that power remains a major motif in the New Testament, not least, as I say, with the resurrection of Jesus. But that brings us to the end of our samples from the books of Samuel and Kings.